You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to A Monumental Relationship, North Korea and Southern Africa, featuring Tycho van der Hoog of Leiden University and moderated by Mr. Ross Tokola of the East-West Center. I'm Keith Luse with the National Committee on North Korea. Today's webinar is the sixth and final installment in the NCNK East-West Seminar Webinar Series on North Korea's foreign relations, past and present. You can find past webinars on our YouTube channel. I'd also encourage folks in the audience to check out northkoreaintheworld.org, a website jointly run by NCNK and the East-West Center that showcases a broad collection of information on North Korea's foreign trade and diplomatic relations. On behalf of my colleagues, Daniel Wirtz and Esther M., and myself, it's been a privilege to partner with the East-West Center with Dr. Satula May, Ross Tokola, Sarah Wong, and their team on this tremendous webinar series. We are pleased to have Mr. van der Hoog with us today to discuss North Korea's historical involvement in anti-colonial and anti-Apartheid movements in Southern Africa, particularly in Namibia, as well as Pyongyang's contemporary economic and military ties in the region. Mr. van der Hoog is a PhD candidate at the African Studies Center Leiden and is working on the project Blood, Bullets, and Bronze, the North Korean involvement in Southern Africa, 1960 to 2020. His research specifically deals with the diplomatic, military, and economic ties between the DPRK and African liberation movements. I'm especially pleased to have Ross Tokola to moderate today's discussion. Ross is the executive associate to the director at the East-West Center in Washington, where he gives advice and support to Dr. LeMay on ongoing near-term and long-term strategic projects and programs. Previously, Ross was a program officer at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies during his 5 years in Seoul, and he worked for the U.S. embassies both in South Korea and in the United Kingdom. Before we get started, let me encourage members of the audience to submit questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. And by the way, I really would like to thank the audience because so many of you have been with us throughout this entire series. So we really appreciate your participation. Ross, I'll turn it over to you.
Keith, thank you very much. And I'll also say that it's been an absolute pleasure for us at the East-West Center to be partnering with you and with Dan and Esther and the team at NCNK on North Korea in the World and on the North Korea in the World webinar series. So again, thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Tycho van der Hoog, for joining us today. Before we begin, I'll share a little bit more of your bio. He previously taught at Leiden University's Korean Studies BA program and has worked as a project researcher at the Leiden Asia Center, where he investigated North Korean forced labor in Africa. His monograph, entitled Monuments of Power, The North Korean Origin of Nationalist Heritage in Namibia and Zimbabwe, appeared in 2019. He has conducted extensive field research in Namibia, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Korea. So with that, Tycho, thank you very much again, and over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much for hosting me, and also a warm welcome to everyone who is attending. In recent years, the United Nations has implemented and monitored the largest sanctions regime in history against the DPRK. But despite this fact, several African countries have maintained military deals with the DPRK. And I can name some examples to illustrate this point. Mozambique had acquired air defense systems. Tanzania had signed military contracts of over $10 million. Angolan armed forces were trained by North Korean instructors, and a military base in Namibia was extended by North Korean laborers. All this is to say that there is a practical reason to understand the ties that bind the DPRK to the African continent. The question is, of course, why is this happening? This webinar is appropriately titled A Monumental Relationship. And I must confess that until a few years ago, I was blissfully unaware of any ties whatsoever between the DPRK and Africa. This changed when I traveled through Namibia for fieldwork for a very different project, and I encountered several prominent North Korean buildings while I was there. Among them were the National Museum of History, the State House, which is where the president lives, a national cemetery for the heroes of Namibia, and a building that is either described as a military museum or a munitions factory. And I'm still not entirely clear which description is correct. Well, all of these grand nationalist buildings that I saw, they were constructed very recently, usually by North Korean forced laborers, and I quickly became fascinated by them. But I must stress that Namibia is not an exceptional case. One can find similar constructions across the entire Southern African region. And this is why I'm thankful that this seminar also takes this broader approach. I very much believe that we can use these monuments to improve our understanding of the DPRK African enigma. And let me highlight 3 components that are closely intertwined with the buildings that I mentioned. The first is the importance of a regional perspective, because the monuments highlight the transnational connections between Southern African states. I already mentioned this national cemetery in Namibia, which is a direct copy of the National Cemetery in Zimbabwe, which was built a few years earlier. And this cemetery, in turn, is a direct copy of the Revolutionary Martyrs Cemetery in Pyongyang. So we see a clear connection not only between Namibia and Zimbabwe, but also to the DPRK. I just want to stress the point that in this part of the world, a bilateral lens does not make much sense. The second component is the legacy of the liberation struggle, which is very visually celebrated through these North Korean monuments. Today, most Southern African states are ruled by former national liberation movements. Among them are, of course, South Africa and Namibia, but also Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Angola, and to a certain extent, Botswana. The DPRK connected to these organizations during the wars for independence in the previous century. And the monuments that highlight the struggle simultaneously justify the enduring rule of these ruling parties and are also a visual reminder of their ties to North Korea. And this brings us to the third and final component, which is a shift in focus from states to ruling parties. I firmly believe that our unit of analysis in this context should not be an African government, but a ruling party more specifically. Instead of Namibia and North Korea, we should talk about SWAPO and North Korea. SWAPO being the former liberation movement and today the government. The same goes for most other Southern African states. To sum up, I propose that this change in perspective is the key to unlock the mystery of contemporary military deals between North Korea and Africa. And I look forward to engaging in a discussion.
Well, Tycho, thank you very much. Perhaps to start, I was wondering if you could tell us more about what the liberation struggles looked like from 1960 to 1990. What were the relationships between African movements like in the DPRK in terms of diplomacy, personal friendships, military training? So thank you, please.
In the 1960s, most of the African continent was liberated, except for Southern Africa, where a couple of states were still being subjected to colonialism and white settler rule. It is in this context that we see in each country a number of liberation movements that are emerging, so to say. And they were almost automatically pushed out of their country into exile. So this is why the transnational element is very much important. We do have a national liberation movement such as SWAPO in Namibia. But for the most part, SWAPO operated outside Namibia. And this happened in various places across the world. But I want to highlight the frontline states, which is a constellation of states between Southern Africa and the more northern part of Africa, which provided a safe haven for these movements to organize themselves. They provided space for headquarters, military training camps, also to train them in terms of diplomacy, vocational training, all that sort of stuff. And this is really the context where we see the emergence of North Korea as a partner. So these movements, they were pushed into exile. They found a safe haven in, for example, Tanzania or Zambia or Angola, for example. And they were looking for all kinds of support. The problem is that many of these liberation struggles were violent struggles. And most countries in the world, particularly the Western countries, were not eager to provide military training, except, of course, for many socialist states, among them North Korea. So we see the frontline states as the place where the first connections between these movements, these anti-colonial movements, and the DPRK emerged. And this happened in various ways. You mentioned military training, which is very important. It was a very practical form of assistance. There is also this idea of diplomacy, where these resistance leaders, they go to Pyongyang, they're being received as statesmen in waiting, and this was really important to develop the ties between North Korea and these movements. But there's also the issue of ideology and ideological training. So really, it's just a wide range of activities that emerged basically from the 1960s up until the 1990s.
Thank you. Well, to follow up, how did North Korea select which movements to support, and which movements did they not support? And what was in North Korea's interest in giving this kind of support to these liberation movements? Was it merely in terms of hard currency they received from the sale of from the training and from the weapons, and even its art sales? So what was North Korea thinking in supporting these liberation movements?
At the time, I believe that the DPRK had a very practical investment in the liberation struggle, which was mainly came about because of the competition with South Korea. After the Korean War ended in 1953, both Koreas were in need of international allies, and in Africa there were a lot of countries that became independent and were potential allies to them, particularly in the United Nations, where they obviously had an important vote. This is, I think, the context why North Korea first invested in these movements. They did have a very different tactic than South Korea. North Korea deliberately tried to invest in liberation movements before they became independent, so as to make sure that when a country became independent, it was on their side, basically. What happened on the North Korean side is that they were trying to make sense of what was going on. And we have to remind ourselves that this was a very messy era. So each African country had multiple liberation movements that were competing with each other for recognition as being the sole and authentic representative of their peoples. And I was told by a former defected North Korean ambassador who also worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that there was a system in place where the North Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs made a comprehensive analysis of the diverse liberation movements. And they basically asked, what are their chances of success? And then they presented this choice to Kim Il-sung, who had a personal interest in the liberation struggle himself. He saw himself obviously as an anti-colonial guerrilla fighter, so he connected to these early African freedom fighters on some level. And ultimately, Kim Il-sung decided what movements to support. It happened a few times that they were wrong, so to say, in the sense that they were supporting a movement that ultimately did not secured independence. Examples are Zimbabwe and Angola. And these are cases where the DPRK actually switched alliances with national liberation movements. So they first supported one movement in Angola, for instance, the FNLA, And then when they saw that, the course was, the tides were changing, then they moved their support to the MPLA. And this also happened in Zimbabwe with their own liberation movements.
Oh, it's very interesting. And in this, as you said, messy time, did North Korea work alongside other communist partners, maybe China, the Soviet Union? How much was North Korea acting independently, and how much did they cooperate with others?
They were very much independent. I think it's a mistake to think that they were basically a vessel of the Soviet Union or China. I found cases where the DPRK worked with either China or the Soviet Union, but basically their appeal as this non-aligned nation was really what convinced also these liberation movements to partner up with the DPRK. This is also what made North Korea very different from South Korea, because they were not allowed into the non-aligned movement. And it's been recognized by the actors themselves, as I've read in various archives, that really the appeal of North Korea was their independent foreign policy. They were very successful in painting this picture of themselves as a small nation in a very rapidly changing world, where they were able to follow their own course despite heavy international pressure. This appealed to African liberation movements then, and it appeals to African governments today.
Thank you. And with that as background, were there any changes in North Korea's engagement with the region after the dissolution of the Soviet Union? And you mentioned ideology. How much did that play a role in, say, liberation movements' interaction with North Korea? How much was that a draw for them?
It did play a role, but I do think that the main driver of events was the liberation struggle, and not so much the battle between communism and capitalism. There is this interesting phenomenon of cultural diplomacy which occurred during the liberation struggle, where North Korea tried to spread their Juche ideology throughout the continent and throughout Africa. This is very interesting. There were these Juche study centers where African students were able to learn the words of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, and those books they were translated not only into English but also into African languages such as Swahili or Afrikaans. I don't think this was very successful. There is not so much evidence, in my view, of these liberation movements really choosing DPRK because of their ideological point of departure. I really do believe that there was a practical necessity for weapons and for training, and on the side of North Korea for new allies that kickstarted this relationship. You mentioned the change in the 1990s when, with the dissolution of the USSR. This, of course, led to a famine in North Korea and many problems for the DPRK. And this very much changed the relationship with Africa, because they were no longer, they didn't have any money basically to support those embassies, to invite leaders to Pyongyang, to give Kalashnikovs for free. So the relationship changed quite drastically, I believe. And when the DPRK was not able to provide aid, they wanted to use those African countries as a means to gain hard foreign currency. And this is really what we see today with the monuments, which is just a money-making machine for the DPRK.
And how has a North Korean engagement with the region been affected by UN sanctions? And you've mentioned North Korean embassies. What have been the North Korean embassies' role in the region with the sanctions being in place?
The role of the embassies really have changed with the changes of the 1990s. At first, they were places that were very important in spreading these weapons, books, ideology. They were hubs for travel to Pyongyang and other places within North Korea. And then this really became pressured by the lack of money. And today, every embassy in Africa is trying to earn an income in order to maintain the post, basically. So every ambassador or an embassy staff is really trying to make money in different sorts of ways. And there is evidence that this happens a lot through illicit activities. So we have examples of the smuggling of drugs, ivory, counterfeited money, that sort of thing. And whenever an embassy is successful enough, it means that they continue to exist and that those ambassadors can stay abroad. So there's a clear self-interest for the staff to engage in these sort of activities. And I really think that this is an area that needs to be explored more. Also because we need to change our idea of what an embassy is. In context of North Korea and Africa, there is not a clear distinction between an embassy and thereby the state and companies. So we see in terms of the monuments, for example, that embassy staff is working together with companies like Mansudae that provide those monuments, or Komit, which is the primary arms dealer of North Korea. So it becomes like a muddy picture where diplomats are being able to use their advantages of diplomatic status to carry illicit goods across the border and smuggling all sorts of things. So I hope to look more into this.
And one last question before I take an audience question. Speaking of illicit activities in the monuments, you mentioned forced labor had been used in construction. Has there been a crackdown on forced labor in Southern Africa since the UN sanctions came in?
Yes. Yes and no. At first, it seemed that the sanctions didn't matter very much. There's a lot of evidence of contemporary dealings with the DPRK, even as early as 2016, 2017, despite the sanctions. And when the United Nations panel of experts tried to clarify what was going on, often their calls for inquiry were unanswered. So there was a clear hesitancy from the side of those African ruling parties to account for what was happening. I actually think that in this respect, that pressure from the UN didn't matter very much, but pressure from the United States mattered more. And we have some examples. I mentioned the example of Tanzania, for instance, where they hired a few technicians to repair some F-7 fighter planes, I believe, I think in 2017. And only after pressure from the US, those technicians were sent home. So yes, there is a change occurring, but it is quite slow. And I feel like we are also missing some activities. So in recent years, we had quite a lot of attention for these large companies like Mansudae, these large art studios in Pyongyang. But there is really interesting research being done on smaller entities that do not construct these grand monuments, but construct smaller constructions like roundabouts and swimming pools and that sort of stuff. But if you amalgamate all of these activities, you still end up with like a large number of money. So I think that I expect there's more going on than we know at the moment.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Turning to the audience, Albert Hong from Radio Free Asia. He says in 2016, he personally covered a North Korean hospital in Tanzania. After the report was published, most of the North Korean hospitals were closed due to the Tanzanian government crackdown. However, he heard that it has reopened and is still operating. What industry earns the most foreign currency in Africa for North Korea? Why does North Korea's foreign currency earning business continue in Africa? Partially answered, but please, more comment would be helpful. And what benefits can North Korea provide to African countries? And furthermore, do you think that North Korea will continue to advance into Africa despite difficult circumstances such as sanctions against North Korea and COVID-19?
Thank you very much. These are all really interesting questions. Let me try to answer them. The medical thing is very interesting. I hadn't mentioned it. There are some other examples of African countries, for instance, in Angola, where we also see North Korean doctors. I don't think this really is a money-making machine. It doesn't surprise me that despite pressure, they keep popping up. I do think that the construction work is the main way for the DPRK to extract foreign currency from Africa. I also expect that this relationship will continue despite international pressure, but it will become much harder, not only because of the sanctions, but more because of the news reports, like was mentioned in the Q&A. This really puts pressure on these governments to act, and there are a number of cases where this has worked. For example, in Namibia. Did I miss something?
I don't believe so, but if anything comes to mind, please share. And I'll share another question from this time from Damian Reddy. He says, thank you. And he wants be interested in your comments on the relationship between South Africa and North Korea today, especially coming from the time of North Korea assisting during the anti-Apartheid movement. And could you also comment on whether North Korea can be viewed as a contemporary apartheid state today?
Wow. To answer the latter question, no, I don't think so. Depending on your definition of apartheid, I think that's quite different. The relationship, particularly with South Africa, is different, I believe, from neighboring Southern African states. And I really wondered why this is the case. And I think I might have two explanations, but I'm still hesitant. So I'm very eager to hear what other people are thinking. The first is that there was already quite a strong ideological development within South Africa, particularly in terms of the Communist Party, not so much the ANC. So there wasn't that much of a need to engage with the DPRK compared to neighboring countries. I think that the SACP might have played a role in this, I think, but I'm not entirely sure. The second is, and I think this might be a more convincing explanation, is the timeline of the struggle. When South Africa only became independent in 1994, and at this time, North Korea had already drastically changed its course in terms of its foreign policy. It wasn't able to spend as much money and give aid as it did in the 1960s and 70s, when it was economically more powerful. So I do believe that also played a role in this kind of skewed relationship. That being said, there is evidence of a similar trend. So there is evidence of ANC fighters, for instance, being trained in Angola, which was a frontline state. And I think in 2005, 2006, when a North Korean prime minister visited South Africa for the inauguration of Jacob Zuma, who became the president, Zuma explicitly thanked North Korea for their assistance during the liberation struggle. So I would conclude by saying that yes, there is a relationship, but not as important and decisive as it was in neighboring countries.
Thank you. The next question is from William Newcomb. He's asking, he says the MOP contact details are murky. To your knowledge, do they involve sizable kickbacks? What is your estimate of North Korean average annual earnings from dealings in Africa in recent years, civil, military, illicit? And I'll add to that Glenn Ford's question about forced labor. Is North Koreans paying bribes to get these jobs abroad? Is it different in Southern Africa?
I have no way of estimating how much money is being made by these monuments, partly because I firmly believe that we are missing a lot of action. So I would be hesitant to guesstimate an exact number, but I do think it is significant considering the fact that North Korea is economically quite isolated, at least in the financial system. Could you kindly repeat the question on bribes?
Glenn Ford is confused about the term forced labor, or at least wants more clarification. Is it North Koreans paying bribes to get jobs abroad, paying bribes to liberation movements, governments? What exactly is the nature of North Korean labor in North Korea? I think that's the question he's asking.
Thank you. I have no problem calling the construction work in Africa forced labor. I've worked in a research project at Leiden University where we've encountered concisive evidence of these laborers that they had to give away 80% of their income to the state. They were not allowed to have their passports with them within the country. They often had to take on extra work outside of like the regular contracts in order to maintain a certain standard of income. They were not allowed to roam freely through the country. So I think by all definitions, and by definition I mean the International Labour Organization, this really is forced labor, despite the fact that it might be that North Korean laborers are keen to go abroad. I don't disagree with that notion. It's probably correct. Nevertheless, the circumstances in these compounds are quite terrible, and I believe we should be more vocal about this. Not only look when we talk about North Korea about nuclear weapons and that sort of stuff, but also look at the actual persons doing the labor that are being subjected to gruesome circumstances. In terms of bribes to the national liberation movements, I wouldn't know. I do think that there is a very personal relationship also between the ruling elites in Africa and DPRK. And again, I want to highlight the third point of my introduction, which is a shift from states to movements, liberation movements, because it doesn't really matter if we have like a change in precedent. The elites of these ruling parties are still being populated by people that often have a personal connection to Pyongyang.
Thank you. Next is from Victoria Zhu. She says the non-aligned movement was very important to the emergence of the DPRK as a well-known socialist state till the late 1980s. Through the visits to Kim Il-sung, would you say DPRK was admired for its free healthcare and education? Was it North Korea's relationship with the liberation movement, not based on ideology, but more on its desire to be seen as an influential socialist state? So returning to some of your earlier comments, but please, further thoughts. Do you agree with this perspective?
I do agree. There is this beautiful videos of African leaders that visit Pyongyang before they became like the independent presidents of their countries, and they were absolutely impressed by what they've seen. So I do think that this like personal role was important. Sorry, can you repeat the last point that you mentioned?
Would you say the DPRK's relationship with liberation movement was not based on ideology, but more on its desire to be seen as an influential socialist state? Was it about their view of their own standing?
Yes, I agree that the ideology of Juche was more like window dressing and foreign policy than an actual desire to spread the words of Kim Il-sung throughout the world. I also believe that both sides of the relationship, both the African and North Korean side, had a very practical understanding of what they were able to achieve with each other. And for the DPRK, this was obviously recognition as the one true Korean state on the peninsula. And for African countries, this was, or liberation movements, this was also recognition. And this is why these visits that I mentioned were so important. Sam Nujoma was the first president of Namibia, but also the leader of the anti-colonial struggle, visited Pyongyang at least 4 times before he became the president. And each time he was not welcomed as some guerrilla fighter from Africa, but he was welcomed as a statesman in waiting, as the true president of the Namibian people. And I think that made some sort of impression on the first generation of African leaders. And I also believe this is connected to the point that was raised earlier about the contracts that were being given for these companies like Mansudae. Most of these projects, they were not publicized in an open tender, but they were given directly to the DPRK by the people that had visited the DPRK. So for me, this is a quite powerful explanation of what is going on.
So turning to your research, you've done extensive field research, and you've been going into archives that don't have websites or not digitized. Through your research, what are some of the, say, more interesting or surprising source materials you've come across?
Well, I think it's really interesting to talk to people who proactively were building these relationships. I mentioned a North Korean defector before. He worked in various African embassies throughout the Cold War. So this is a man who, has seen everything firsthand, and that to me is very intriguing because lots of those stories do not end up in an archive. I also want to stress the point that in order to understand the ties between African countries and the DPRK, it is important to use African source material. And this often is not happening. And there is also a reason for this, because it can be quite difficult to excavate the source material, but it is definitely possible. So I can give you one example of a training institute, a Namibian training institute in Zambia. So this again shows the transnational component of the liberation struggle. The archives of this institute are currently being cataloged. I was able to use them, and they have a large collection of North Korean materials, not only like books and papers and that kind of stuff, but also a journal which is focused on Juche around the world, where there are first-hand descriptions of African students, liberation leaders, journalists, professors, going to Pyongyang, going to schools, visit farms, and they were describing what they were seeing, what they were feeling, etc. So this gives us like this first-hand experience of what it was like. And I hope to include this as much as possible in my dissertation.
Oh, that's brilliant. And I have a question from Jay Brannigan. He's saying, with China's push into Africa over the past 15 years, backed by China's resources, has North Korea become less relevant to Southern Africa coming up to the pandemic? Please.
I don't think so. There is a stark difference in what both countries are building. So China is building a lot of infrastructure, which is important, ports, highways, railways, that sort of thing. But we should take a closer look at what these monuments truly represent. And they represent this idea that a liberation movement is allowed to rule indefinitely because of their victorious role in the struggle. And the visual language that they are using to tell this story is a North Korean visual language. And to me, this is just absolutely fascinating, because it tells me that those African elites are honestly impressed by what they have encountered with their North Korean counterparts, that they are so able to adopt the same visual language in order to make their point and to legitimize their rule. So I do think there is quite a difference between DPRK and China in that sense, in the sense of political culture. If we would discuss the financial component, then it's completely different because it's just incomparable what is happening right now.
Thank you. And I have one very specific question from Satoru Miyamoto. He's researching the North Korean participation in the Angolan Civil War. He's asking if you happen to know how many North Korean soldiers participated in this war.
I would love to talk to you because that sounds very interesting. We should meet up after this. The numbers that I've seen in archival repositories around the world is usually 3,000 North Korean soldiers / instructors. I have no idea whether this is the case. What I also have been focusing on is a training school in Angola, I believe in Kibaksi, which is a few hundred kilometers from Luanda, the capital, where during the 1970s, there were actual North Korean soldiers training SWAPO insurgents and ANC insurgents. So that could also be a connection. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't be of any more help.
I can follow up later on. You've been researching this rich and fascinating, but really untouched area between African studies and North Korean studies through your field research and through your projects. Just before we close out, what's next for your research? What is there to explore? What's fascinating for you in the coming days and months and years?
Well, I do hope to return to Southern Africa for more fieldwork. I was cut short in March 2020 because of the pandemic. I was in Namibia, but I had to return to the Netherlands. I do think there is much more material that has to be unearthed and that can help shed a light on this era in history. And I really do wish to combine the strengths of African studies and Korean studies together. Yeah, I think there is much more to be said about this topic, and particularly about an inside perspective of how these relationships were forged and nurtured. So we have lots of like outside sources to roughly sketch the relationship in terms of military deals and a visit to Pyongyang, but to really to get a look inside on what it was like and why choices were made, the way they were made, that is still waiting to be discovered.
Are there particular sources that you'd like to explore that you've not yet been able to, or that you're planning to once you're able to travel more freely?
Definitely, yes. But I would like to see most are the archives of liberation movements in Africa, which is very difficult because history in this part of the world, like most parts of the world, I guess, is extremely politicized. And it's suspected that these archives contain all sorts of secrets also on the dark pages of the liberation struggle. So it is very difficult to get access. That being said, I will definitely try, and I also hope to speak to people that have been there. Many of them are probably still alive. So that will be the next challenge.
Well, that's brilliant. Tycho, with that, I just want to thank you again for joining us for this webinar series. That was fascinating. It's an absolute pleasure. And again, I want to thank our colleagues at the National Committee on North Korea for our partnership with East West Center and the North Korea in the World Project and on the webinar series. I encourage everyone here to go back and look at the past webinars, to go to the northkoreaintheworld.org website, to sign up for NCNK newsletters, follow social media, and those of the East West Center as well. Thank you all very much, and have a good day.
Thank you.